Everybody knows that happy customers stay longer than unhappy customers. I mean, virtually everything we do in business is based on that. So it'd be kind of a big deal if that turned out to not be true. I had this experience so many times where a customer would be leaving and on their way out would say something about what a great experience it was or how happy they were. And that drove me crazy because it didn't make sense, right? And then I also had the other experience a lot, which was where a customer would be frustrated, unhappy, and yet would keep renewing their contract. And this created this dissonance, like that doesn't compute given what we know, fundamentally what everybody knows, which is that customer satisfaction is what drives customer loyalty. This has been the ruling, principle of business for as long as I can remember, certainly a generation. And so imagine how frustrating and confusing it is when you constantly get a counter message. And I've spoken to literally thousands of people who've had this same experience. In fact, it's so common that when you describe it, they vigorously nod their head and laugh and have various other responses. And it's incredible. So why is it so common? Like, what's going on, right? What if customers that are satisfied stay and customers that are dissatisfied leave, then why is that so often apparently not the case? And that drove me crazy because at the same time, my experience over and over again was that customer retention and churn seem to be ethereal. They seem to be somewhat idiosyncratic, out of our control, and hard to predict. And in fact, it wasn't the out of our control part that bothered me the most. It was the sense that we really couldn't tell who was going to succeed or fail, who was going to churn or retain. And so those are the conditions in which I have over the years been increasingly interested in this question. Do customers that are happy really stay longer than customers that are unhappy? And surprisingly, given that that's such a universal belief, there are very few, if any, evidences that it's the case. There's virtually no data or research or some way of establishing that that's true. And so I've been intrigued by this, and the anecdotal experience that I described obviously is not a sufficient stand-in for something that would systematically establish one way or the other the idea, this principle. Okay, so naturally, I was very sort of looking for, interested in scanning for any evidence one way or the other. And several years ago, I ran into this book, The Effortless Experience. It's by the same people who did the Challenger sale. And they, in the book, they report a research effort that they did, rather large, over 100,000 data points, where they were looking at customer loyalty. And one thing they looked at was what's the relationship between customer loyalty and customer satisfaction. And what they'd expect, obviously, is that customers with low satisfaction would have lower customer loyalty, and customers with high satisfaction would have high loyalty, and everything in between. But when they actually plotted the data out, this is what they actually saw, only with 100,000 dots. So it shocked them. They actually couldn't find a statistical correlation between satisfaction and loyalty at all. And that obviously shocked them. It's a surprising result. At the time, I was surprised it didn't get more attention. And so that was the first thing that kind of made me pause and say, maybe the anecdotal experience that I'm having with real customers isn't that unusual. Maybe there is a pattern here. And so, but what I really wanted to do, and the test that I always thought would be the most effective, would be something like the exact level of satisfaction the customer reports using some satisfaction scale, plotted against how long they stay, literally their customer lifespan. Well, two things have conspired to allow us to run this test. And the first is that we have, through our work with our clients and partners, et cetera, accumulated a very large data set, hundreds of thousands of customer data points with lots of detail about the customers. And then the other thing that happened was the emergence of NPS as the world's most popular customer satisfaction instrument scale. For those of you who don't know, NPS stands for Net Promoter Score. It's essentially a one-question satisfaction survey instrument. Essentially, it asks you whether you would recommend the product or company to others. And the scale is 0 to 10. And because this instrument has become so popular, we have a large number of companies in our data that use the same score. And this is really nice because it allows us to compare different companies across different industries, et cetera, to see, what's the pattern. And so we were able to run this test using NPS as a satisfaction score and customer lifespan. And so here's the study. We were able to get 133,000 data points for this study. And what you'd expect, obviously, is a low score, which is a low level of satisfaction, would correlate with a shorter lifespan, and a high score ought to correlate with a longer lifespan. But this is what we actually see in the data. So there's literally no statistical relationship whatsoever between customer satisfaction score and how long they stay. It's an incredible result. And it's not just, to do with this score, this NPS, or these companies. We've actually tested a whole bunch of different satisfaction scales. And every time we get the same result. There's no connection. There's no relationship between how satisfied customers report being and how long they stay. And so this is really fascinating, right? It's a kind of a big deal. That's an understatement. It's a huge deal because, just think about all the things that we do that are based entirely, ultimately, on this idea that if we make customers feel a certain way, feel satisfied, feel happy, you hear the word delight a lot. If we delight customers, if we exceed their expectations and make them feel good, that they will be more loyal to our product, our company, our brand, etc. But there's no evidence that this is the case. In fact, there's quite compelling evidence that the two are uncoupled, that they're not related to each other. Now, it's not that there isn't a thing called customer satisfaction. It's not like we're not measuring a real thing. That's a real thing. And one of the reasons we know it's a real thing is because a lot of companies have mastered producing it. And I've seen over and over again companies with low satisfaction scores implement a series of systematic processes that reliably increase satisfaction. So it's a thing, we can measure it, and we can move it up and down. But the issue is that it has nothing to do with customer loyalty or how long customers stay. And that's a big deal. That undermines, in my opinion, its value. Now, it's not that I wouldn't argue, for instance, that we shouldn't make our customers satisfied. We shouldn't do those things that produce customer satisfaction. Of course we should. Shame on us if we don't. It's just that they don't produce higher customer retention. That's not their effect. That's not the mechanism. So again, it's incredibly impactful. There are so many implications of this fact. Now, okay, so customer satisfaction is a real thing. We can measure it. It's not related to customer retention. Then what is? If customers who are satisfied don't stay any longer than customers who are unsatisfied on average, then what is driving it? What if customer happiness doesn't predict customer retention, what does predict it? Well, the answer is quite interesting because there are two elements to that. The first is that is actually found in the data, the NPS data itself. Okay, so if you look at the data set we have for this study, 133,000 data points, we had a 14% survey response rate. 14% of the customers responded to the survey and supplied a NPS score. That's not bad. That's probably pretty typical, although it varies somewhat. But across a number of companies, that's starting to get to be a reasonably typical response rate. Okay, so 14% responded and supplied an answer, and what we can see clearly is that their level of satisfaction does not correlate to how long they stay. But what about the other 86% who didn't respond to the survey? Do they show a similar pattern? Is it, and the answer is no, actually. There's a very interesting difference between the response group and the non-response group. And the difference is simple. The non-response group, the customers who did not respond to the survey, consistently have significantly shorter customer lifespans by a significant distance. So that's interesting, right? What's going on? The respondents, whether they're happy or very unhappy, all stay reasonably on average a similar lifespan. If you didn't respond to the survey, you almost certainly have an extraordinarily shorter lifespan. What's going on? So there's a signal here for sure, right? The data has a signal in it. And it has to do not with the level of satisfaction that you report. The signal is in whether you responded to the survey at all. So what does it mean? What is that signal? Well, I think that's the first clue that there's something going on and that we can see that it happens systematically at scale. My argument is that what you're seeing in that signal is level of engagement. So for some reason, customers who feel inclined to respond to a survey, and it could be because they would wish to register their displeasure, or it could be because they don't feel particularly strongly low or high, but they wish to respond. And it also could be that they're very happy and they'd like to make that known. But what they all have in common, apparently, is that they all felt it was important enough to respond. And the non-response group is signaling the opposite, that this isn't important enough. So there is an engagement signal here. And I think that's a hint as to where this is going, because it indicates that for some reason, some customers think this is important and other customers don't. There's some threshold of the degree to which they care. So that was the first hint. The other one is that we have a huge amount of data, quite a bit more than is in this study alone. And so we've actually had a chance to test a whole bunch of different factors. And we've tested all sorts of different things, dozens of different things, almost anything you can think of that you might hypothesize is a systematic factor that correlates with customer retention we've tested. And one interesting sort of general observation is that there are actually quite a few that correlate with retention. In fact, the fact that satisfaction systematically never correlates with retention is pretty unique, actually. There are very few factors we can find that have no correlation with customer retention. Customer satisfaction is the most uncorrelated factor we've ever tested. Now, there's in all the factors we've tested, there's a number that are sort of very mildly correlated, or might be strongly correlated, but for a reason which is not causal, right? The one doesn't cause the other. They're both the outcome of something else. But in the course of doing all of that, we did find one factor that consistently and by far and away is the strongest, best predictor of customer retention. And that is customer results. So when you look at customer results, measured customer results, what you find is that what would you say, some portion of customers achieve results. Now, those results could be very modest or they could be very spectacular. But if you divide customers into two groups, the group that has achieved any level of measured results and the group that hasn't, what you find is that the group that's achieved measurable results stays significantly longer than the other group by a large margin. And this is really interesting because it potentially explains the experience I started with, that experience where you have customers leaving saying how happy they are and customers who are unhappy and yet keep renewing. This is, in fact, I think, the missing link. Here you've got a factor which would explain why an unhappy customer would nevertheless keep staying because they're achieving the measurable results for which they joined, signed up, purchased, etc. And you have a customer leaving who's happy with the experience, but isn't achieving the key results that they need or that they expected. So that's really powerful. And every time we test this, using different ways of looking at it, because it does vary a lot between companies, whatever the closest proxy is to measurable customer results is the most predictive factor there is. So I think this is the answer. It's not customer happiness. Customer satisfaction does not drive retention. Customer results drive retention. And the implications of this are obviously huge. So I'm going to be talking about them in subsequent videos. Hopefully you'll come back and learn. We have a number of other very interesting research results that support this and also flesh out, give more detail, explain better what's really going on and what we can do about it. So I hope you'll join me. Bye-bye.